that was some bump back down to earth for Norwich City. Welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn.com Norwich City podcast in association with Future Radio. My name's Connor Southwell, joined by Paddy, Davitt and Samuel Seaman. We've walked up the road to our office here at Prospect House to reflect on, hopefully not reflect too much on it, a 3-0 defeat to pace-setting Burnley in what was a pretty grim afternoon, maybe quite a humbling afternoon for Norwich City as well. Pad, hard to really reflect on that one because, I mean, as we walked into this game, Burnley were 20 points ahead of Norwich. That gap has obviously grown. It feels like we've not really learnt anything new in the sense that we knew Norwich City weren't going to be in the top two come the end of the season, but that probably emphasised just how big the gap is between Norwich City and Burnley.
Yeah, no, I mean, you say we haven't learnt anything new. Unfortunately, I think we've had a reminder of what we already knew in terms of some of the deficiencies in that group of players, really. And the problems didn't begin and end with Dean Smith and Dean Smith's exit. And that's been visibly underlined this afternoon at Carrow Road. And yes, it's Burnley, that's now 9 straight championship wins. I think they're on for a record. I think 10's the record, apparently. As you said, 20 points clear at kick-off. And in that first 20-25 minutes, it was pretty embarrassing, the deficit in kind of approach between the two. You know, one set of players clearly understood what they were trying to do and were executing it, and Norwich's, I'm afraid, were a long way short. And in that period, obviously, there was, and we'll get into it in further depth, but there was a very charitable concession from Tim Krul. So, yes, it was probably the best team in the Championship they faced, but still, I mean, some of the residual concerns around this group of players were there again to see, and it's concerning that David Wagner, while he was fairly measured in his post-match, I think he'll look at that and feel that, while knowing that there was work to do, maybe the scale of it has been underlined today, because there was no semblance of that was coming with the 2 previous away wins. The cohesiveness that they'd brought to the performances, but today, no, nowhere near. And he packaged it basically in that post match that it was essentially 3 errors, not individual errors, because the 2 goals they conceded off corners you'd look at collectively an abdication, but 3 errors. And you take those out, and he kind of inferred there wasn't too much in it, really, and maybe in terms of chance creation there wasn't. But I think the reality was, anybody who watched that game, Burnley cashed in, as all good sides do, on any vulnerability or, weakness in the opponent, and thereafter they coasted. So, pretty dispiriting, really, after the first 2 games and the Farker in the Championship. But maybe it just underlines that, it isn't, for all the positivity that's been brought by a change of head coach and the character of this head coach in particular, and the way he carries himself and his messaging. He doesn't have a magic wand. He's working with the same set of players that Smith had. And today was more evidence that there are issues in that group of players. And as a result, it's not obviously back to square one under Wagner, but, it feels like a step back, and they'll need to pick up the pace, because we're recording this as the results are just coming in the Championship. But I think when I looked at the league table prior to you hitting record, they were 9th. So they're going to be in that sort of ballpark, 3 or 4 points outside the top 6. You're talking about top 2. They're going to have a job on to get in the top 6 if today is representative of what they're going to produce over the coming games and the coming weeks, because they really do need to package this, put it to one side, learn from it, and then very swiftly, starting with Bristol City away next weekend, get back on the horse, as it were, and get that man back in the driving seat and get the bus out of first gear, because today they were, woefully short, woefully inadequate against the best side in the division, to be fair.
Yeah, the table, as we say, some of these aren't full times. I think they will become full times as we progress deeper into this record. Norwich currently 9th in the Championship as things stand, 3 points behind Watford in 6th, 5 points behind Middlesbrough, who are winning 3-0. So who have won 3-0 as that result just comes on the bottom of our screen against Blackpool. So we're beginning to see, Sam, a little, and this is kind of what I suspected might happen in the weeks ahead. The Championship table, which has been so erratic, and that race for the top six has been incredible, really, for the opening 30 games or so of the season, 29, 28, whatever. It's beginning to take a little bit of shape now. Norwich now, and we'll probably end the pod on this, but they've got a relatively favourable run coming up. I think they're playing 5 teams who are 15th or below. That might have changed since in fact, it has changed since the games this afternoon. It's going to have to happen soon, isn't it? This kind of run of form, because even now, I think we're looking at it as 17, maybe slightly more than that. I'm not very good at maths. I'll work out the maths while you were answering, but there's a certain period of games left. I think the average that they would need is 2 points a game to get to 70, which hasn't guaranteed playoff positions in past seasons. So the odds at the moment, and again, probably more so in the wake and the rawness of this defeat, does feel stacked against them again somewhat.
Yeah, and I think it's probably important to look at the context. They were quite a lot further, I'd suggest, away than they are now a couple of games ago, and those 2 consecutive wins points-wise made a significant difference. In the Championship, you're always one run away from really propelling yourself up the table. So I don't think Norwich fans should feel particularly downtrodden about it. I don't think they're out of playoff contention or anything like that now. But what it does feel like is a bump down to earth and a reality check for any fans that thought, from now on, or from Wagner's arrival on after those 2 4-goal wins on the road, that it was just going to be plain sailing. I think we all knew there was going to be a time when things weren't going to be quite as easy as they have been so far, and I actually think the reaction to this is going to be the most revealing thing, really. We've talked this up for a while as the first real opportunity to assess how ready this David Wagner side is for an actual promotion push and to compete with the sides they want to be competing with at that end of the table. And today they've really come unstuck. So can they find the mentality and the drive to be able to recover from that quickly? Because that's what you have to do in the Championship. Wagner referenced it in his press conference, how quickly things come around, and I think he'll relish the opportunity to turn things around as quickly as possible. But it's whether his players can do that, because there are probably a number of Championship teams who don't have the quality throughout the team and the consistency to be able to rely upon those players, and they have to rely upon different runs of momentum to propel them up the table. And I think Norwich don't want to get to a place where they're guilty of that. They want to be able to show that they can bounce back from these sorts of scenarios. So it's certainly not out of reach, the playoffs now, but they can't slip straight back into that mentality that they had under Dean Smith, where it felt very, very quickly, as soon as something went wrong, that everything was wrong, and it was only heading in one direction. David Wagner's team, even at Huddersfield, that ended up being promoted, were, when things went wrong, they went really wrong, because that's the nature of David Wagner's system. It's sort of all or nothing, and when you get unstuck, you really do get unstuck. So I think I can see a path for them back into the playoffs, just to try and add some positivity on an afternoon where I'm sure plenty of Norwich fans are feeling quite negative. But this has outlined that just because they've changed head coach, it's not going to be a 10-game winning streak all the way to playoff bliss and potentially even promotion. Norwich really do have a fight on their hands because of how they've done over this season, and as I see them slipping down to 10th, it's getting more and more.
I was literally about to say it. You mentioned the word positivity, and I've got a league table in front of me, which is live because the results are coming in.
That's right.
And Norwich have just slipped down to 10th, so that's quite something. And Swansea look like, because they were 3-2 up, and they're now 4-3 down to Birmingham, a 97th minute winner. So the Championship has been, and they're back up to 9th. There we go. we can end that on a
way more exciting than deadline day.
This is, isn't it? Yeah, it is. We should do this every week. It'd be great. Be great, and a draw for Ipswich at Cambridge as well. So it's not all bad. It's not all bad. Paddy, I mean, it's right what Sam says there, and David Wagner did say this, I think, in his open, or Stuart Webber might have said this in his unveiling press conference, where Norwich are going to have days like this, where because of the system that they're trying to transition to and the fact they're doing it mid-season, they're going to have some days where it doesn't look or function particularly well. which probably leads us nicely to that first goal and to Tim Krul's error, because he has said previously that if players make mistakes playing out from the back, that's on me. That's the way I encourage them to play. That's the way I want them to play. So is this kind of those errors that we saw today, and we'll come to the set piece ones, but specifically the Tim Krul one, is that just a byproduct of this kind of teething period that we're going to see, where Norwich City are probably going to have weeks like they did, particularly Preston, but maybe the second half against Coventry, where they blow teams away, but they're also going to have some really difficult afternoons where it does look slightly dysfunctional?
Yeah, that's a fair comment, but I think a lot of this discussion, you do have to keep reiterating it's against a team who are the best in the division, will go on and be the champions, and were able to exploit the vulnerabilities that Norwich exhibited. That palpably hasn't been the case. Coventry had a spell of 2 goals in that midway through that first half, but thereafter Norwich were able to resume control. Preston likewise never really had put any dent in Norwich. So I think it underlines the levels in the Championship, and they've played the best today, and they will punish you ruthlessly. And it was a bad error, and we've seen that in both those 2 games from Tim Krul, and got away with it. That poorness with the ball at his feet, and Wagner was asked directly about, is Krul comfortable enough to play that football at his feet in his post-match this afternoon, and he felt it was a slightly unfair question to ask, and made it clear that today anyway, at least, you talk about an error there, but there was collective errors in terms of not marking men, not marking space for both the corners, and both of those led to goals as well. So he's right to draw that parallel, but I just think with Krul particularly, because it's set against the backdrop of, certainly outside the bubble, a sense that Angus Gunn was very unfortunate to be removed from the starting lineup, and of course today, because of a hip issue, he wouldn't have played anyway, but Tim Krul has had to deal with that kind of backdrop that, most Norwich fans, I think it's fair to say, felt he was very fortunate to come back in, and any error he was going to make was going to be magnified, but unfortunately he's made a very big one today, and only he can answer what was his thought process there, because it looks horrendous in real time, and every replay I've seen since, it doesn't cast him in a favourable light in terms of what was going through his head at that point. And as I say, you're playing against a team with players who will punish you at this level, and that really did set the tone, and the inverse of what happened at Preston and Coventry, where Norwich came out of the traps and really took control of those games and never looked back, and they wasn't able to, when they fell the wrong side of it, wrestle the initiative back. And for me, I think it's harsh to maybe sort of extrapolate this was all on Tim Krul, because I think in the game generally they didn't do enough. They didn't work Burnley's keeper anywhere near enough. Their midfield, I thought, was so far off it today. McLean, Zara, Dowell, Hernandez even, who have impressed collectively and individually in those 2 away games. Second best today against Burnley. The speed they moved the ball at, the intensity they played at, the width they put on the game. Norwich just couldn't handle it in that first 25-minute spell. And unfortunately, the headline element of that period was Krul's error. And who knows, if they had navigated it and as they did, sort of grew into the game, it might have been a different outcome. But inevitably it will fall on Krul, because it was a major turning point so early in the game. But just collectively, I think you can't dismiss that. For me, they wasn't at it at all today, and why Wagner needs to get to the bottom of that. Was there an inferiority complex with Burnley? Were they kind of seeing a team who are rolling into town on the back of 8 league wins and the consistency they've shown, and there was a sense of maybe not quite believing they could get something today. If so, that would be concerning. But I just think they were so second best in that 20-25 minute spell, which Kompany himself referenced. Vincent Kompany after the game, he thought that was really where the game was won, the way that Burnley set themselves up and dictated what happened in that opening period, and thereafter it was just basically managing the game from Burnley. And obviously they were gifted then two further goals from corners. But inevitably a keeper makes an error as costly as that, it's going to end in a goal, and unfortunately, as I say, it's not just about today, it's the backdrop of Tim Krul coming back in when I think most outside the club anyway would feel he was very fortunate to do so. So, we'll see now moving forward what that means for Tim Krul, but it's unfortunate. But there was a sense maybe that was going to happen at some point if anybody had watched the two previous games, because he did something very similar in both those games and unfortunately wasn't punished as he was today.
Yeah, and that was the point I was going to make with you, Sam, really, because there was one at Preston. I want to say Cannon was the player who benefited from that one, but I might be wrong. Might have been the other Preston striker, but at Coventry it was Gustavo Hamer. Very similar incidents. I think these were both from open play, though. I think to be honest, I don't really get what he's tried to do, because he's tried to find Max Aarons, and I think he's just rushed it. And whether he's not looked, I mean, replays suggest that he has looked. I mean, Zaruri doesn't move, so his position hasn't changed, and he's still played that pass. But I think even if he plays that pass, he absolutely kills Norwich in terms of trying to get out of that situation, because he had Andrew Omobamidele to his right, Grant Hanley to his left. Just a very strange decision. He could have played it to Omobamidele, invited Burnley's press on, and then Norwich would have had the outball of Max Aarons on the right. So a very bizarre decision if that pass would have been completed anyway. Obviously even more bizarre that it isn't. But this has been coming with Tim Krul, hasn't it? And whether you attribute it to rustiness or whether this is kind of what we've seen from Tim Krul down the line, and I think we've seen enough of him, as brilliant as he has been for Norwich City over the piece and throughout his involvement with the club, that he does have this type of error in him, particularly when it comes to distribution.
Yeah, and it's something that Angus Gunn certainly doesn't have from what we've seen of him in a Norwich shirt, and that's been the main question for me throughout Krul's time in a Norwich shirt, really. Yes, he improved that under Daniel Farke. I imagine that took a significant amount of work under that regime to do, but in the modern game, especially under coaches that want to play football the right way and want to be able to pass the ball out quickly, I don't see how you can afford to have such a significant flaw in a player's system. In a system, in a player's, a weakness in a player where that is so key to that system. So it probably is becoming quite difficult for Wagner to justify, even when you stack it up all the positive intangibles of his sort of dressing room influence and his experience and his leadership as well. If you had anybody else on that pitch that had such a significant hole in their game that so massively related to the system and how they played it.
I'm going to jump in just because I think that and it's not necessarily the argument you're making, I understand, but a lot of people do say, the experience and the leadership point. Well, I don't really get the relevance of that, because if you're making mistakes like he's been making in recent games, what does leadership do? And again, I think Angus Gunn has showed no more or no less leadership than Tim Krul has this season, in my view.
No, I agree with you, but it's the answer that,
of course,
I know. These coaches give us. Every time that we ask them why if you pick these players, it's whatever. I mean, even today, Wagner was saying about caps for the Netherlands, So they do use that as the explanation, and I agree with you. I'm not sure quite what it contributes, but if head coaches want to come out and tell us that that's the reasons why they're in the team, we have to take them at their word for it, because frankly there doesn't seem to be that much of an alternative explanation for why Krul firstly is in the team in the first place, and then Wagner, it feels harsh to be criticising him this early on in his tenure, but that seems to me a really difficult decision to be able to explain. I can't find a reason why he would first of all pick Krul and then keep him in the team, when I was speaking to my dad yesterday and we both agreed we couldn't see a situation where he plays for the rest of the season and doesn't make a big, a howler and gives away a goal. I don't think there are too many Norwich fans that would have looked at it prior to today and said, I believe in Krul, not even to be impressive, but to just not make a massive error between now and the end of the season. So that's one of the only decisions from Wagner so far I really struggle to justify. And it's like you say, but what relevance does the experience point have? Not really any, but what other explanation are we supposed to fit to it when there doesn't seem to be one?
It's just a nonsense argument. If you played every player on experience, you'd be playing 36-year-olds every week. It's pointless. What does it mean? I don't get what it means, and it feels like, again, as much as that's maybe a tick in the box of Tim Krul, it kind of feels like, well, Angus Gunn is basically not playing because he's younger. Is that kind of what we're saying? Because that's a really flawed argument itself. But I mean, and we can have a debate about that all day, but we'll move on. I mean, Paddy, there are a lot of Norwich fans who really love Tim Krul, really grateful for what he's contributed at the club, and he's contributed enormous amounts during his 4.5, nearly 5 years at the club. And I don't think anyone can have any debate that, you know, if let's say he left the football club tomorrow, I think he would have tributes pouring out of his, there'd be tributes everywhere. There'd be a lot of love for him. He's still a very popular figure. He has a great connection with the fan base, and we've spoken about connection on a wider point this year. But it does feel like Norwich City's best goalkeeper isn't playing at the moment. I know he had an injury today, so that perhaps is something to throw into this argument for balance. And I think David Wagner said after the game that he's unlikely to return to training before the end of the week, Angus Gunn. But it still feels like Norwich City's best goalkeeper isn't playing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately there's one opinion that matters in this debate, if it is a debate we're having, and that's David Wagner's. And from Preston onwards, he decided it was Tim Krul for him. Nobody in this room, I think, is of a different opinion. It should be Angus Gunn in goal. We reacted, myself and you, Connor, fair degree of incredulity at 2:00 on the day of the Preston game when that team news dropped, and we're at Deepdale doing our live team news video, and maybe we're made to look a little foolish come the end of that game because they've won the game and Tim Krul made those, get it right, those two key stops early in the second half. We got the call right. You could argue Coventry got the call right because they won the game, but unfortunately when they don't win games and then they make the errors they have made, and that individual in particular, it will be scrutinised. And it's going to be a difficult one now because, I mean, there may be a get out if Angus isn't really fit for contention for Bristol City, but thereafter, it goes midweek Saturday. There's almost a sense you're waiting for the next error from Tim Krul, and that's not fair on him, really, for the reasons you've stated about what he has given to the football club. Of course, if he's picked, what's he going to say? No, Gaffer, I'll take a step back. I don't want to play. Angus deserves to. Of course, he's going to play. So it's as much on Wagner this as it is on Tim Krul ultimately, and it's a difficult one now because it is becoming an issue. We've spent the last 5 minutes of this podcast talking about it. Plenty of other fans will be talking off the back of what he's done today in this game about it. And do you need that as a sideshow? You don't. He's got enough on his plate as it is, Wagner. But, it's worth stating that all he could really offer when I asked him after the game at Preston, why did you go with Krul over Gunn, was a hunch and a feeling. He did go on to say he'd spoken to both of them and what he said to them would remain private. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall because you would think he would have had to offer a bit more than a hunch or a feeling when he sat and he's got Angus Gunn across the table from him as to why he's actually demoting him effectively.
And for Angus as well, that's happened on a few occasions. It's not kind of a one-off that he's been dropped for something like that. I mean, he's been dropped for a lot less than what Krul's done today, I guess, is the argument.
Yeah, but why did he... I know, different manager now, but why did he come out for Tim Krul for the Tottenham game on the final day of the Premier League season, having ousted Tim Krul and, albeit in a side that were going in the wrong direction, but had justified his selection, I felt. I mean, there was that midweek game at Leicester where he was phenomenal. They lost the game, but through no fault of that man. And Dean Smith, as it was at the time, which it felt like it was this Tim Krul swan song last day of the Premier League season. He was maybe moving on in the summer. There was all that kind of in the background about he might have needed to move on to secure his World Cup place with Holland, which didn't come to pass as it turned out. And basically, I remember Dean Smith was justifying that selection that day, that Tim needed game time because he was going off to play friendlies with Holland. Again, if I'm Angus Gunn, I'm sat listening to that, I'm thinking, what on earth does that say to me? What in terms of how I'm valued within this group of players? And he's in his rights to feel the same again, because through no fault of anything he's done on the pitch and his performance levels, he finds himself on the outside again. Today, reiterate, probably would have come out, well, he would have come out anyway if he had started the last two games because of an injury. But certainly those two previous games, he can count himself very unfortunate. And I mean, you wrote a very good piece about, where does this move on and how does it resolve itself in the summer? Because, Angus Gunn, you can guarantee at the age he is now, is not going to want to get past this season and then be basically told he's probably going to be the number two here, whether that's to Krul or somebody else. So, it isn't just in the here and now. The here and now is what matters, clearly. because there's a playoff push to revive. But moving on, there's other dimensions to this now that come into play for the mid and longer term. And as I say, now David Varner has firmly backed himself into a corner with his faith in Tim Krul, because he almost probably has to play him now at Bristol, although he may have the get out that Angus isn't going to be physically fit. But thereafter, when he is, the next mistake, sadly, we'll be back here again having this debate. So it is what it is. It's ultimately, I guess, for Tim Krul to eradicate these residual issues in his game, which, as I say, were threatening to lead to what the outcome was today, and unfortunately it has done. But 3 games, the same error in 3 games, that's not good enough, is it? And obviously one of them was only led to a goal, but to be committing the same issue over and over and again for an experienced player, it's not good enough.
No, I would agree, and obviously just the last point on Angus, from what we were led to believe, there was certainly from Steve Clarke some persuasion trying to go on to get him to play for Scotland. So I'm sure that's another factor that is in the background as well, and whether that plays a part in kind of that debate that you had there in terms of the long term aspect of it. Because at some point Norwich are going to have to make a choice and go with it, and it feels somewhat unsustainable to have kind of this situation that they've got, where they've got 2 number ones, because one of them's going to be unhappy moving forward, whatever happens. So you have to find a resolution to that, I think, going into next season, whether it's a nice problem to have at the minute or not. Sam, I mean, we've spoken about Tim Krul there, and as Paddy said right at the start, it does feel like a lot of the spotlight is going to be on him, and perhaps somewhat unfairly, because there were 2 mistakes from corners that Norwich City made within 5 minutes of each other, where they failed to win first contacts for both. Vitinho, who made a fairly simplistic movement, really, seconds after coming on as a substitute, where he kind of ran towards the goal line, then pulled back away, did that unmarked. Max Aarons then clocked him, but he's obviously then trying to make up ground to get to him. That pulls him away from the post. That creates a gap. That leads to the goal. The second one, which is a deep ball in, no one tracks Ian Matson with his run to the back post. He's able to, again, completely unopposed, put a ball back across the 6-yard box for Burnley's defender to score the third. And as much as we talk about the Tim Krul error, and that's going to get, I would imagine, as it has done on this show, a lot of debate and a lot of people talking, the defensive situations from those corners were just as bad.
Yeah, it's quite ironic, actually. I saw a stat, I think yesterday, that Norwich had conceded the fewest goals from corners so far this season. And I was actually surprised, because they don't stand out as a particularly impressive set-piece team. And I think Alan Russell has come in for quite a lot of criticism at times this season for obviously being the set-piece specialist and coach that he is at the club. And he's relied upon to improve those situations, but it really was quite amateurish, the way that they conceded those 2 goals today. And it's quite frustrating, actually, when you think about how much better Burnley looked, and Norwich could have earned a point against a team who really are on course to promotion and really did look quite a lot better than them, had they just cut out those errors. And you look at that with the prism of their eventual goal of Premier League sustainability, and you think you probably want a team that actually has that quality, that has that ability to grind out results. And given they actually restricted the number of clear-cut chances Burnley created in open play, they really gave themselves an opportunity, had they cut out those errors, to go and secure a good result, and they wasted it with 3 really poor concessions. First with one after 8 minutes as well. The timing of them is almost as poor, because as I saw somebody highlight earlier today, you work the whole week on a game plan, and after 8 minutes it's basically gone, because Krul's made an error that means that game plan's out of the window in the 8th minute. And it's the same thing in the second half, really. You go into the break, you have an opportunity to assess where you are, to come out, have a fresh start, and I think after 10 minutes they conceded that first one, and 5 minutes after that it's another sloppy concession from a corner. And it really is a poor trait that at this level Norwich have to cut out, and it's something we've seen throughout the season. They got away with it with a 3-2 win over Bristol earlier in the season. I think they conceded 2 goals they would have been unhappy with on that night. There was a really poor goal conceded against West Brom that could easily have ended up with a loss. but actually ended up with a draw when West Brom were really struggling at the wrong end of the table, and Norwich would have expected to get more out of that game. And it's just, I think it's a lack of concentration. That's what it looks like to me, and it's a problem that's plagued them throughout the season and throughout recent history, really, and something you'd like to see them cut out, because they're already up against it in so many different ways. The financial aspect, the fact that they've had such a poor start to the season, the change that's going on at the club at the moment, and the fact that they've only had a new head coach for less than a month. And they really don't need to add to their own woes with individual errors and mistakes, and those corners are a perfect example of that. I think it should be relatively easy for professional players who work all week on preparing for games to combat quite simple set-piece routines, such as the ones that led to those goals early in the second half, and they weren't able to do that. So where the blame rests with that, I'm not sure, whether it's David Wagner or Alan Russell or the players individually, but somebody probably should have taken responsibility and sorted that out before it ended up where it was, because I felt Norwich, given they were restricting Burnley to chances that they were gifted by Norwich, I felt with the attacking quality they had, they always had a chance of coming back into the game while it was 1-0, and to concede so early in the second half, when you thought they might have a fresh start and they might be able to go for it, was really disappointing, and they wiped out their own opportunity there. So I'd like to see them cut that out, probably work on it, but as I said about the statistics on conceding the goals from corners so far this season, probably worth putting it in that context. And I'm not sure the corners are becoming a long-term issue, thankfully, especially given they've paid for a set-piece coach to be there. But switching off and losing concentration is something we've seen from this group fairly often, and those are the sorts of easy wins that you have to be getting when things are quite difficult for you.
Yeah, just to clear up, because all of the games in the Championship have now finished. So Norwich sit in 10th after all of the results at 3:00 today. I think Millwall were pegged back relatively late on, so that's basically pushed them down a place, but also means the gap to West Brom in 6th is only 2 points. So that maybe makes people feel a little bit more positive, but still 5 points to Luton in 4th and to Middlesbrough in 3rd, although Norwich do have a game in hand on Middlesbrough. So that's how it looks. Yeah, I mean Sam's right, Pad, in terms of the set pieces, because they haven't been an issue really this season, and for all of Norwich City's faults in the Championship, actually from defensive set pieces they have tightened up. They have been relatively secure for this season, and Alan Russell deserves, of course, credit for his role in that. So that probably is what will make this game and the concessions they did make from those two corners so frustrating for David Wagner, I'd imagine, because it's not something that has been in their game so far this season.
No, and I'm trying to think. I mean, the two. I mean, yeah, both the goals they scored, conceded against Coventry wasn't a result of that. They were open play, phases of play. So on his watch, that's probably the first time he's seen that vulnerability, and that whether he packages it as a one-off and exploited by a very good team at this level, time will tell. But ultimately, as Sam rightly says, it does shine a light again on some of the residual issues about the concentration and the responsibility at key phases of a game, which that was. 1-0 down early in the second half, the game's over. Game's over in the space of 5 or 6 second half minutes, and it's not Burnley carving them open with excellent football and a clinical edge. It's two reasonably decent deliveries from set pieces and good movement. So I think Wagner himself said, you shouldn't concede those goals at any level of football, certainly not the level that Norwich are operating at, or pretensions to go even higher. So, but we don't need to run away and extrapolate. This is now Norwich's Achilles heel moving forward. Time will tell, and it might, in a roundabout way, we may learn more, or Wagner, more importantly, may learn more from a game 3 games into his Championship tenure about, right, there are issues here that we need to address, rather than a false sense of kind of security by rolling on a few more positive results before the wheels came off, as they did today. So if there's anything to salvage from it, very early on, he's he's now got a real 90 minutes of first-hand experience, sat or stood there at the touchline watching it unfold. I can maybe he'll go away tonight and over the coming days and realise that there's a reason why he's in this post now, and it wasn't all on Dean Smith. That there are issues within this group of players, and he will now quite visibly have seen that he needs to, and his coaches need to very swiftly eradicate them, and if they do that, then I wouldn't, despite them being in 10th, and that feels quite a worrying position to be in the table, but the points differential to the top six and the games they still have, and as you said, there's a favourable run in terms of the potential league status of their upcoming opponents to harvest enough points to get them back into the mix. But because this is being recorded straight off a game where unfortunately it sort of revived some of the more negative emotions around Norwich's championship season thus far. It feels quite deflating, really, after the inevitable optimism generated by what had gone before at Preston and Coventry. But I think he more or less inferred it post match, David Wagner, that as he didn't go overboard with those 2 wins, he's not going to go the other end and feel it's all doom and gloom and overreact to what he's seen. He packaged it as errors, basic errors, and we're talking in this segment about the 2 goals they've conceded from corners. He probably goes away and thinks we can eradicate that fairly straightforwardly, just work on the training pitch. He's clearly a massive exponent of intensity, putting the work in at Colney, and he will feel now, right, okay, maybe there's a few more of them double sessions coming down the pipe, because that isn't acceptable, and he'll be the first to admit that isn't acceptable. For where Norwich have aspirations to get to this season, irrespective of where that would lead them beyond, they need to eradicate what we've seen today, and albeit against a very good team. But ultimately, if you switch off like that against any team in this league, you're probably going to concede goals. So that needs to stop. It needs to be a one-off on Wagner's watch.
Yeah, and I think he said even after the 4-0 win at Deepdale that there was still a hell of a lot of work to do, and he reiterated that after Coventry. It's the kind of game that almost you think he would have, in many ways, even though the result isn't favourable, may have been slightly more beneficial with him in terms of exposing the elements of Norwich City's performance that do need a lot of work, and I think we can all see that. And of course, it's about context as well. It's about the quality of opposition. A 20-point gap between these teams heading into this game. Burnley looked every single point better than Norwich City, didn't they, throughout that contest? Norwich were comfortably second best throughout it, and so that has to be taken into consideration, because they have not played and they will not play a team that are better than Burnley between now and the end of the season, and in many ways that's not the team that they're going to have to beat in order to get themselves in the playoffs. So I think there is an element of just kind of brushing it off slightly and being able to brush it off slightly, whilst of course acknowledging those individual errors, acknowledging the elements that need polishing in training, and almost getting back to it next week, because we will come on to that run, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but there is a block of games now where it does feel like they have an opportunity to pick up points. Sam, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the home form, because it's 1 win now in 11. I think Norwich have won 1 game at Carrow Road since September, which is an abysmal run of form. Obviously, a lot of that happened before David Wagner, to be fair to him, but that is not the type of form that they're going to need. And to be frank, if that sort of form persists, then we're not going to be talking about the playoffs come the end of the season. So, 2-part question, really. Why do you think it has been so difficult for them at home? And how do they go about turning that form around? Because it feels increasingly like it's becoming problematic now in terms of their own season. Because away from home this year, actually they've not been too bad at all.
Yeah, I think there are probably a couple of issues. I think towards the back end of Dean Smith's tenure, there certainly was a pressure coming from those fans. I'm not criticising the fans. I think they were in a position where they had no choice really but to voice their displeasure, but that did put players under pressure, and it did probably make it harder for them to perform at times. When you look at things since they've obviously let go of Dean Smith and under David Wagner, I think the issue has shifted simply to difficult fixtures, and without totally relieving them of any requirement to perform in those games, because I think as a relegated Premier League team in the Championship, you should be competing with everyone, really. But just looking at where they are now and being really realistic about the way that the squad's performed this season, they have played Watford, Blackburn, Burnley in some of those recent home fixtures. Even Reading have produced some pretty solid results in recent times, and they were another team who came to Carrow Road and earned a point. So I think the fixture list hasn't been particularly kind to them, all things considered, and considering the fact that Norwich should be competing at the top end of the Championship every time they're in it, in my opinion. But there probably is a little bit of a psychological element as well. They haven't had the ability to celebrate with their home fans since October, and that probably does take its toll. It probably is a matter of habit, and winning is a habit. And you heard I think Jordan Hugill spoke a bit about it in his interview with you, and when he was speaking to Rotherham's official channels about winning mentality in a dressing room and how that was something he valued so highly at Norwich. And without that winning mentality and without that association that comes with consecutive wins and building up the habit of victory at Carrow Road, you can see why they might turn up at their home ground and not feel particularly confident, or not feel particularly boosted by the fact that they've got that home support. I think there was probably an example of the tension that's been created a little bit today, when that error from Krul so early on meant that the whole concept of playing out from the back was sort of under investigation from those Norwich fans, I think, throughout the game, and it was at a point where it felt more and more tense every time they were trying to play out. And then I think there was actually quite a loud cheer when they decided to, everybody to get together and for Tim Krul to go long from a goal kick. So there are a few elements. I think the discontent amongst those fans has begun to set in, and probably was at its worst, I think, in that 2-0 loss to Blackburn towards the end of Dean Smith's tenure, and maybe is starting to set in again now that results are pretty poor. So I think it's going to be a case of maybe having to just grind out a victory, whether the performance is good or not, and they've probably got the opportunity to do that with that perhaps slightly easier run of fixtures in the next few games that might allow them to, even if they're not at their best, to grind out a result and to find goals from somewhere at Carrow Road. And hopefully that will remind Norwich fans of why they're there and what it feels like to have Carrow Road be such an arena of positivity, and to be a positive for them in that sort of promotion race, but especially against the backdrop of season ticket renewals and that sort of thing. You really do want your fans associating being at that home ground with entertainment and with victory and with a positivity that hasn't been there for quite a while. So for me, it's vitally important that they not only turn that around, a little bit, but they turn it around in a big way, because what you really want, especially in the Championship, is for Carrow Road to be viewed as a fortress, and it hasn't been close to that for a while now.
Yeah, Pat, there's also the other issue that Norwich have, and again, you have to put this in context that today it was Burnley, but it feeds in perhaps to a wider point that they haven't beaten any of the current top six. Certainly, they've beaten two of the top nine, because they've obviously beaten Sunderland and Millwall, but lost twice against Burnley, drew against Sheffield United, lost to Middlesbrough, lost twice to Luton, lost twice to Watford, and obviously drew to West Brom, but that was before they had Carlos Corberán in charge. That was under Steve Bruce earlier on in the season. So, I mean, not that I want to look too far ahead, but given what we're talking about in terms of playoffs, it's not the type of statistics that particularly bodes well. But then I guess, maybe won't even matter. But let's get there first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the collective we,
yes.
we'll save up the wins against the top six for when it really matters in the playoffs. There's no point.
Well, there is the stat from the last one, wasn't there? In terms of they didn't beat Middlesbrough in the normal season, then obviously beat them at Wembley. So
yeah, well, time you run.
Absolutely.
But no, I mean it's not. It doesn't fuel you with the belief that when push comes to shove they can't, because I mean they have to go to. I'm just doing this off the top of my head. They've got to go to Middlesbrough. In the regular season still.
Still got Sheffield United at Carrow Road, still got to go to Middlesbrough. Still got to go to West Brom. Still got to go to
Blackburn.
Millwall.
Will they
Still
play
got to go to
No,
Blackburn,
they've got to go to Blackburn.
and they've got Sunderland at home to come.
Yeah. So, but ultimately, they know where they need to get to, and to get to there, they're going to have to. He's going to have to rectify that. There's feels like we've spent the last few moments talking about diabolical home records, and this is another one that needs to be addressed, remedied, and very swiftly as well. And that is results against the teams in and around you, because that, as we get down the stretch, we're talking about maybe a 2-point gap as we record this to the top 6, but it's those playing the teams around you is when you're going to see real shifting plates in terms of the playoff picture. It's all very well and good accumulating points against the teams who are outside of that mix, but if they're going to stay in touch and overhaul, then they're going to have to find wins against these sets of players. And to be honest, I know the results don't suggest it, but Burnley aside, I haven't altered my original opinion this season. It's such a muchness this league. There is nothing really precluding Norwich from getting results for me against all these other teams. They haven't done it. But even that Sheffield United game at Bramall Lane, how they haven't won that game. Pookie misses the penalty, doesn't he? Were they 2-0 up in that game? At one, I think they were, weren't they? 2-0, and so that partly maybe it's a bit of a quirk of statistics, but of course this stage of the season, you have to say there's probably a bit more to it than that. But I'm not unduly concerned about that particular aspect, but certainly the Carrow Road winning mentality, that has to come and come quickly.
Yeah, and the next block of games really interesting as well. They obviously go to Bristol City next weekend under Nigel Pearson, who are certainly in the bottom half. Hull City, who have had a little bit of a resurgence under Liam Rosenior. So that's going to be interesting. Next one at Carrow Road, of course, on Valentine's Day. I'll let you write your own puns for that. Then we head to Wigan, who are bottom of the table. And to be honest, looked like an absolute circus after getting rid of Kolo Touré after 9 games and replacing him with Sean Maloney. And then Norwich have Birmingham and Cardiff to finish February. And then we do get into some really sort of tasty games in March. So they've got a block of games here now that are going to be viewed as maybe even decisive, because it's an opportunity for them to get quite a big haul of points. And if they're able to do that, who knows, suddenly this season and their playoff prospects look completely transformed. A couple of things to talk about then before we end the pod. Deadline day, that's been and gone. No one's put a bid in for us. We're all still here. The pod's still here. So yeah, we'll go again in the summer. Marquinhos, obviously the only incoming signing. Sam, Christos Schollis returned. We've said plenty about kind of their business in January, but just in terms of today, Christos Schollis came on. Marcelino Nunez also came on. We didn't see Marquinhos. Were you a little bit surprised at that, or not, given that he probably hasn't had a lot of training sessions since he arrived at the club?
Yeah, less so, given I think Wagner said in his press conference that he saw Schollis being more ready for it than Marquinhos, and that doesn't sound like a player who he was particularly confident would feature. I was actually surprised Schollis came on when Wagner's original 2 substitutions were Adamida and Marcelino Nunez. So yeah, I think it was good to see Schollis back out on the pitch. Admittedly, not too much to remember that performance by, but probably harsh to judge him on a substitute appearance against a team top of the league when Norwich were already 3-0 down. But I think Marquinhos, it might be somebody who it takes 2 or 3 weeks to get used to things and get used to Wagner's system. It does seem quite strange, the idea of a 6-month loan under David Wagner, when he's such a sort of system coach and a bit of a project manager, and somebody who talks quite regularly about inputting his ideas into players, because you'd think the amount of time that's presumed to take would mean sort of 6 month loans are by their own nature sort of doomed to fail in a sense, because they're there for short-term impact and for a player to be able to boost a club in a very short space of time. So that is a little bit of a worry for me with the Marquinhos situation. I think with Schollis, even if he doesn't end up helping with the promotion bid too much this season, he's probably a player that Norwich see developing into a big player for them in the future. And I think Wagner's spoken about how his task is to make that happen, basically. But with Marquinhos, I'd like to see signs from him sooner rather than later, purely because of the amount of time he has left in a Norwich shirt. But from Wagner's comments, I wasn't feeling particularly positive about the chances that we'd see him for a significant amount of time this afternoon. So I wasn't really especially surprised. But what a 3-0 defeat does is it sort of resets the starting lineup balance, and it probably gives Wagner a chance to go back to the drawing board and gives all the players a chance to really impress in training and force their way into Wagner's thoughts, because there aren't too many players based on today's performance that have enough credit in the bank to demand that they start at Bristol in a week's time. So I'm quite looking forward to seeing Wagner's team selection when we get to the Southwest, and perhaps we do see the likes of Jolis and Marquinhos play a more significant role. But for now, just given the amount of time that they've had at the club, I wasn't particularly surprised that they didn't play a starring role this afternoon.
No, likewise, a couple of other bits then. Season tickets, the renewal packs, is that the right term? Renewal packs, they were sent to people. Yeah, I think that's what they're called. They're lettered. They were letters this year anyway. And the prices have been frozen, which is, again, interesting, given, obviously, the economic times that we live in. We could have a big debate about that, but I think ultimately it's up for, obviously, individuals to kind of make their own judgment on what that means for them and various aspects around that decision. But the other thing I did want to speak about, Pad, just to close the pod, was obviously since we last recorded the pod, Norwich announced that they were going to have another emergency, I think it was an emergency general, it might have just been a general meeting this one, but certainly a meeting to discuss more shares being made available, which again at a time where we talk about we have spoken about Mark Attanasio and his involvement at the football club, which seems to be growing, and I would expect the vast majority, if not all of those shares that potentially could be made available to go to them. It's an interesting time, isn't it? And I guess it's interesting timing as well in terms of how this has come about and when it's come about.
Yeah. I mean, as we've said on a few various platforms we've recorded about this topic, all we've got is another procedural hurdle or confirmation of, beyond that, we're then applying the context. I don't disagree with your version. I think that's probably where this is heading. But more will come out, I'm sure, at post, is it the 13th of Feb?
Yeah.
I think it is, yeah. And if that is how it's resolved, then, you're getting to a stage where, you're effectively going to have a very balanced lead shareholding mix between the Attanasio Group and the current majority shareholders, and that all flows into a sense that this incremental steps of getting to know you phase, that's obviously going very well, because they wouldn't, I'm sure, embark on this course of action so soon after. It was only September, I think, that we had the previous meeting to confirm the Folger shareholder private transaction to the Attanasio Group, but more pertinently, a place on the board for Mark Attanasio. So the proximity of that to this suggests that the intervening period has gone, in terms of the relationship, very well. I think it's safe to say that they've been very astute how they've stayed out of the picture. Yes, they did a little bit of media around that trip they made for the Middlesbrough game. But in terms of getting to know the business, accepting what they don't know, trying to implement what they do know, perhaps, behind the scenes. And I think this is just another visible sign in terms of the shareholding mix that, they're in it for the long haul, and it's probably a case of when rather than if they eventually do take control, as they did, in a very similar fashion to the Brewers. And 17, 18 years later, they're still in charge and in control of the Brewers, turn them into, relative to their resource base, very competitive in Major League Baseball. I'm sure that's what a lot of Norwich fans hope is going to happen here, but clearly that tells you this isn't going to be an overnight fix. This is a long-term project, and this is just another part of the next phase of the journey, really. But that's probably certainly not going to impact hugely in terms of what happens on the pitch over the next 6 months. But if it goes through in the direction we anticipate, then maybe in the summer you will start to see a real tangible input from them in terms of, particularly if the club is still in the Championship, what it looks like moving forward, because clearly they're not coming in just to backseat drive. They want to come in and really put their stamp on this club and try and apply some of the principles that have, as I say, transform the Brewers to Norwich City. They see a lot of parallels, a lot of synergy. I think we all do, looking at it from the outside. And ultimately, something does need to change, because it's fundamentally the case that under the current model, they're not competitive when they go to the Premier League. And whether it was this season or next season or seasons to come, they got back there again. They need to do something different. And this is clearly an attempt to try and do something different.
Yep, that's a very serious way to end the pod. We usually end it on some nonsense.
Well,
have you got any nonsense?
Well, I probably shouldn't. But when you were talking about transfer windows, we did make a bid for McDennis, but it was rejected out of hand. So you can guess which party rejected it out of hand. So there's a bit of frivolous banter, as they say.
That's your usual standard of reporting, Paddy. There we go. Sam, any nonsense?
No. Hot dogs in the press box. Fun.
Yep.
There's nothing fun. That's a serious business. Hot dogs.
Yeah, Paddy missed out.
It's not. There's no fun in me finding out after the event that there was hot dogs in the press room.
Well, to quote Chris Wilder, you got to get there earlier. You knew there was going to be a rush.
That's true. This is the thing. While us lonely reporters are grafting hard, the Norwich City editors swan in late doors and miss out on the sausages. I think that's a lesson for us all.
Yes. I don't think I have any other nonsense, so we'll leave it on that. Thank you very much for listening to this week's podcast. Of course, you can follow all of our work across the PinkUn channels, PinkUn.com or the PinkUn Plus app. You probably get sick of us saying it, but I'll say it again. There's a free trial available for you to get at PinkUn.com. Just click the PinkUn Plus tab at the top of the website if you are subscribed. Thank you very much for your continued support. We'll be in Bristol next weekend for the game against Bristol City. It's going to be absolutely fascinating, and we will catch up with you all then. Thank you very much for listening. See you again very soon.